am going to talk about is the India-Australia relationship and where it can go from here on this particular space. But firstly, thank you to the Australia Institute of International Affairs for having me here. I know it is very important in Australia, especially to acknowledge the land of where we are. I will not try to co-opt and do that from an Australian's perspective, but just as an Indian to say that I really value that recognition that people have, because even in India, I think it's very important to recognize the land of your ancestors and the indigenous and tribal folks that have built that land that you are on. So whether you're in Australia, India, or any other part of the world, I really value that that sentiment that you have here, and I appreciate it. I know there's some controversy around it, but I very much appreciate it, and I like to mention that anytime I'm speaking in any sort of space in Australia. How do I? Is it that one? Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. I can't read myself what's on the screen. Sorry. I'm going to block you a little. It doesn't appear here as well, but the Australia-India partnership, right? So a strategic overview. Maybe if I went over there, it might be easier for other folks as well. No, that's all right. I can read from here now. So the strategic partnership between these two countries has been, I think, as one would know, it's been growing quite a bit. We have the bilateral partnership, and I'm not going to read everything because it's all up here, and this is all common knowledge. But it is, I will to say that this is a relationship that is considered to be one of the fastest growing in the world in some ways between India and any country at this moment. It is largely, I would say, because of the existing Indian diaspora in Australia, which is quite large compared to several other countries in the world. Obviously not as large as what one has in the UK or in the US or other parts of Asia, but it is definitely one of the largest and it's the fastest growing. I recently read that one of the most registered surnames for newborn babies in the state of Victoria, and I live in Melbourne at the moment, is Singh. Right, so I feel like I should say I apologize in advance, but there's going to be a lot of little things running around soon. And then the second fastest growing surname is Kaur, right? So lots of little things and Kaur's babies, and then the third apparently is Smith. So there will be some balance in that sense. But it's a relationship that's also growing really quickly in some ways because of the leadership, and that's between this and I should be very politically correct, but I'm really not, and Ian will know this, but there is some bromance between our two prime ministers, which I think is trickling down now to other spaces. There's also a great friendship between the two foreign ministers. They are apparently, as the Indian High Commissioner said publicly, so then I can say this, also great WhatsApp friends. Right, so they talk very often, and I think that has helped inform then what this relationship could look like. I know from India's perspective, they were quite pleased in some ways that there is a continuity of government in Australia, so that working relationship will continue. Right, so bilateral partnership, economic ties. In some ways, this is the fastest growing as well. We've got this target of USD 100 billion by 2030. If you actually look at the fine print, there's not much clarity as to how we're going to achieve this 100 billion by 2030. But I do know that a lot of business interest, the current ECTA, which we are hoping to create into a full free trade agreement, goods and services on both sides, is where that is going to then achieve that number. Education, mobility, this is an old story, right? Indians coming to Australia to study, not so many Australians coming to India to study, but more in terms of vocational training. There's a very large growing number to look at some of these other aspects, people to people connection, regional collaboration, right? And I'm going to focus a little bit on the regional collaboration and look at the Pacific more in detail. Now, climate cooperation, right? And this is what I am doing here in Australia. Is I'm on a DFAT funded fellowship. This is a fellowship that was set up post an agreement between India and Australia to increase this relationship in various different spheres. So we have a lot of it that is sort of moving forward, and what that moving forward, I know there's a lot of debate between many people as to whether it's actually moving forward or it just seems like it's moving forward. And I think we can debate that, but I think there is some movement. The argument is that if we just look at the number of trips that have been taken by top leadership to each other's country, and I'm not sure if that is actually translating into much, but one of the things it has translated into is the setting up of the Center for Australia-India Relations, which runs a number of different programs, including this fellowship program that I am now a member of, and I was part of the inaugural cohort. So I'm here for a year and a half to understand what is climate resilience look like if we interplay that with long-term security and defense in the Pacific. What is it that India and Australia can then do together with partners in the region? I think that's a really important aspect of what I would like to stress on, is with the partners. So the way India does foreign aid is a little bit different from how Western countries have done aid in the past, which is now, I would say, changing a little bit, is that it's more demand driven. It's to understand what local contexts look like, and then how we can go in and work with that reality to look at then the relationship between long-term climate resilience and security, and then defense, right? So if we look at our climate cooperation, just going back a little, starting from 2020, within the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which is now coming under review, there were some interesting focus areas of agriculture, water management, science, research, and maritime cooperation for an free and open Indo-Pacific. And in the last 5 years, this term of free and open Indo-Pacific has suddenly become, the catchphrase for everyone. But what does it really mean? What could that actually translate into? I think is some of the areas then that need to be delved deeper into. But what is very interesting is that in this comprehensive strategic partnership that Australia and India have, where we talked about agriculture, water, and maritime cooperation, it's very unique, because if you look at some of India's other strategic partnerships with other nations, when it comes to a strategic partnership, we haven't actually delved really deeply into aspects of agriculture, food security, health security, water security. So we did that with Australia. We've done that with a few other countries, but that was quite unique in that sense. And I think that's a bit telling as to where we would like this relationship to go, even if it's like nowhere near. And that's the path we're going forward on. The other interesting thing on the climate side here is our energy partnership, right? And collaboration on solar, green hydrogen, energy storage, circular economy. Now, all that sounds like, okay, great. Everybody's doing solar and everybody's doing green hydrogen and energy storage. So, what's the big deal? The big deal over here is that it's not just looking at large scale projects. Actually, this energy partnership is looking at very small scale projects, which is what I would say in some ways is India's forte and expertise to a certain degree, is to identify what are the small scale interventions that then have positive cascading effects going forward. So where are we putting our interventions? Whom are we working with? In that case, I would say in at least in the energy solar side, a lot of India's projects are very much focused on working with local communities and with women in those local communities to ensure then that project is long lasting and sustainable. And so within that REP right now, which, I mean, it was just recently launched, but it's now under discussion as to how we are going to implement, where we are going to implement. There is a definite strong community angle, and there's definitely a strong gender angle, which is quite, I think, very important. And for somebody like me, the work that I've done, I think that's really telling of where this then relationship could go, and how it can also then inform how other countries are doing this kind of work, right? Because a lot of the European countries, for example, do exactly this kind of partnership with different countries in Africa. And I wanted to just bring that up because we have His Excellency here, but it doesn't look at it from a community perspective, barring a few. I'm not going to make that generalization, but in general, it doesn't. I know because I work with a lot of the European countries on this specific thing, in parts of Africa and in parts of the Middle East, and I know that that community angle is lacking. So I think that's really an important point. Lots of critical mineral cooperation. Australia is one of the largest suppliers of critical minerals in the world, and it's just going to grow. What they have tapped into here is minimal. I recently wrote a piece with a colleague who's a critical minerals expert. I am not one at all. I barely know, and I just recently learned apparently there's like some 70 of them in my cell phone. I'm only looking at it from a climate perspective. I'm like, how much water are you going to use to get out all those minerals, right? Western Australia, Northern Queensland, where those minerals are, there's not that much water. There's also a lot of heat. There's also a lot of the supply issues, right? So then there's the issue with the communities again. So how do we balance all of that? And I think our critical minerals cooperation right now is at such a nascent stage that we can actually do it well, if we think about some of these aspects. And so a colleague and I wrote about bridging that critical mineral and climate lens, and we've presented that paper to both the foreign ministers' offices in both the countries, and they said they've read it. We'll see. There's lots of stuff on the tech transfer. I'm not going to go down that path because this is not my space, but I do know it's an important one to mention. And then there's some science and a lot of research and feasibility studies being done on the offshore and wind. I mean, this is just to say that this is what our climate cooperation looks like. And the reason I put some of these different aspects over here is because when we talk about climate cooperation globally, the tendency is to say, what are we doing on greenhouse gas emission? What are we doing on financing, right? And all of that's important, but all of this is also extremely important. I think it's really good that our relationship is at least thinking about some of these aspects and putting them on paper. We haven't moved forward much beyond that, but this is a good starting point, right? Just some initiatives that I thought might be interesting to mention is our rooftop solar training academy. And very often we think about what does the policy actually mean. We might have these like really fancy agreements and these MOUs, and I'd mentioned to the group earlier, is that drilling down on these policies is where then we see the meat and the action of it. How do we ensure that what's on paper actually translates into something that is lasting and makes sense, and something that you can, at least I feel like one should be a little bit proud of. And so I think there's not much, again, and I know there's a lot of criticism to say that this relationship right now is looking great from that high level perspective, but if you drill down, there's not much. And so, but there is the way we have begun and the kind of work that we are doing says that we can actually take this slowly, but in a positive format. And so these 10,000 Indian professionals who have been trained for this under this academy, they will finish their course next year, and I've interviewed a couple of them. And it's interesting that they're doing that training in Australia. And one of the things, the reasons they're doing it here and not in India, because we have the International Solar Alliance in India, which was co-founded by India and France, and now and Australia is also a member, along with several countries around the world. I think there's now 100. There was a recent ceremony for the 100th country. Is because the way the heat effects in Australia are a little bit different from how we're experiencing them in India. And the training also includes that component to understand different kinds of heat effect and the cascading risk from that, which sounds very small and mundane, but it's very important because those cascading risks have different kinds of health risks that we are not thinking about in India, but we have to think about, and vice versa over here. So some of these kinds of training programs are also introducing understanding what long-term heat risks, what kind of risks they will bring, and then what do we do to mitigate some of that? So that climate resilience, to go back to my original point, is not just about, lowering the greenhouse gas emission and more financing, but also about actually doing bottom up things. The other great part about this is now these 10,000 professionals, some of them are actually going to go into various partner countries. And this is where now some of my researches and my recommendations to the government are coming in, is which partner countries in the Pacific can we match the kind of heat that we are going to see, not just on land, but in the sea, because a lot of the heat effects that we are seeing in the Pacific are affecting the coral, they're affecting the fish life, right? And the Pacific Islands are extremely dependent on their fish for their trade, for their sustenance, and for other aspects. So they're going to bring this knowledge and work with local communities over there. So it has very long, like cascading benefits in that sense. And so it, training 10,000 professionals in installation might seem like a very small project, but when used right, it has very long-term benefits in that sense. What is also interesting is that because we are seeing different kinds of manifestations of heat on also security and defense installations, right? So there was a couple of Australian generals, and I won't name them, but it's all very Googleable. A few years ago, had said that the heat is causing a lot of problems to their ships and their military installations in parts of the Pacific. This now combined with the fact that there is more maritime presence because of trade, but also military activity from various other countries, they are unable to move the way they used to move. Add to this another layer of more climate related events, right? So earthquakes, tsunamis, flooding, extreme rain. And so his military was more involved in reacting than being proactive in anything, right? So a lot of the understanding of what all of this means is now going into the defense structure as well. And that's not just in India, but that's also in Australia, and that's in partnership with certain other countries in Asia as well. So how do they then bring that relationship between the climate related risks and hazards, the heat, the military installations, and then look at all of that in a package for long-term security. And the interesting thing is that this academy that is only training these 10,000 Indian professionals is also going to add on a layer to start then creating a course that might start training defense professionals as well, as to how do we rethink and look at heat. It's not yet started, but there is some discussion on that. So which is why I put this one example up over here, because I thought it's a very interesting way of looking at how there are different spokes to one specific event. It's not event, but one specific like program that has been set up. That's actually a very small program, and it's cost-wise, it's actually quite tiny, but can have so many different benefits and circles to it, right? Within the regional initiatives and I put this picture. My team who helped me put the presentation together, and if the PPT is nice, it's because they did it. I only the text is mine, but putting it together and making it look nice is all the young ladies in my team. But we picked this picture specifically because if you look, there is obviously you can see the different kinds of sea movement in terms of wind and current. And you can also see the air current movement. And for those who are not, uh, climate scientists or folks in that sense, all of this is actually current from, you see the blue lines, yeah, that is different kinds of water current, and then the lightly shaded ones are all wind current, right? So you see how there's constant movement, and I just wanted to put that up there because I thought it's an interesting way to depict then what this region looks like if you didn't pinpoint all the islands and you didn't pinpoint all the cities and the capitals and all of that, but from a movement perspective of weather, of climate, of temperature, and currents and all of that, right? So that's what the region is dealing with, and so trying to understand that from a very nuanced perspective becomes really important. And if you add now layers of, if you imagine the map where you added layers of like constant movement of ships, trade, military, maritime activity, then people are moving around. Then you have all the planes because these islands are really far apart. And I'm trying to visit the Solomons, and I've realized I have to take these really tiny planes to get anywhere. And I travel a lot, and I've traveled a lot my entire life, but I hate flying. Like I really hate it. I much prefer the big planes because I somehow feel much safer in them. But now I have to take the little ones, and I will take the little ones. And oops, somebody's having a party somewhere. um, so, but there's constantly a lot of those ships. So all of this is disrupting and is also then being disrupted by what you're seeing if we removed all those layers, right? So how do we understand all of this from a nuanced perspective? And I think then strengthening some of that. I mean, we have already all of these different commitments, there's all these different regional initiatives, but none of these regional initiatives are trying to understand that interplay between what climate actually and weather actually means to then long term resilience that can lead to long term security. And so that's where my research is sort of been focusing on. Um, I'll just quickly run through what I think are some interesting like areas that we can do work on, right? And I want to focus on the food security because it seems like it's a very, at least to many folks, it seems very like unsexy when you talk about long-term security, but it's so fundamentally important. And the food security came into many people's sort of attention very specifically, I would say, during COVID, because of global borders just shutting down, and we realized how dependent we were on globalization and trade and everything that goes with it. But also after that, with the Ukraine war, right? And a lot of my people and partners in Europe were like, "Oh my God, because of the Ukraine war, there's a wheat shortage," and I'm like, y'all have no idea like what food shortage actually means, and I've lived in places where there was real shortage, and I mean I'm not like decrying their needs, but I think it was important to then really work on what food security means and what food security cooperation could look like. It's not about just getting in there and food packets and aid and feeding people, but it's about again building long-term climate resilience as a means of long-term security. And so I thought the food security cooperation, which in between India and Australia is very small, which means it has a wide open playing field. There's any number of things that we can do. And my first set of recommendations that has gone to the government is actually looking at this, right? And it's gone to DFAT because I'm here at their invitation, but it's also gone to the Indian government as to what this might look like and where we can then build it with local partners. So specifically, I've been looking at Fiji, Vanuatu. Papua New Guinea is an important partner over here, but I'm more looking at Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, and the Solomon Islands because their resilience structures are much lower than some of the bigger countries. And one of my so I've looked at what is actually happening and then how we can take that and build upon it. Because to ask a country to say, okay, let's start a whole new program and a whole new project and put, whatever, $50 million or $500 million behind it, that's very hard. But if we say, okay, you've already got these programs, I'm just asking you to like expand them or add on or include a different component, it's usually a lot more palatable, right? And so agro-meteorological investments. Now, there's already weather forecasting units all across the Pacific that have been previously set up by Australia and by New Zealand, some of them also by China and Japan in the past. So there are different kinds of units. So my only recommendation has been in two parts. One, have some more standard methodologies of how we gather that data and study it so that these systems are talking to each other. And this is very easy to do. And the other is what India has actually done for all of its meteorological units across India is to create them in different languages, right? So we just bring that IT knowledge, which India is so well known for, is that lovely software of what we did to ensure that every single local unit speaks to the local community in its local language. We just bring that software to the existing systems in parts of the Pacific Islands, create all of their systems in their local language so that then they can talk to a wider community. It's using the units that are already there, right? So that idea has been actually quite well received because it's things that are already existing in play, and to turn that software, apparently it's not very complicated. It's a couple of years of software work on parts of some smart, IT fellows in India and a few $1 million. So they were like, oh, this is actually quite easy to do. And a lot of the countries that I've spoken to in the Pacific are quite receptive of this, right? So how do we look at these like little ideas that can actually then work going forward? And the other thing that I think is really important to talk about is the gender inclusive climate action. Within the ISA, India and Australia, there's already this women-led implementation in the Pacific Island countries. What I have recommended is to actually expand that program and bring it into the schools so that it can then become a vocational training certificate course, right? And then if they want to do that program at a high school level, perhaps if you don't have access to university life or you cannot afford it or you don't want to do it, it becomes a vocational training course. And then you can work in your own country within the Pacific Islands Forum. My idea was also to expand that, and then maybe within that forum, they can then work in other countries. But I'm still unclear a little bit about the dynamics of how the relationship between all these countries work. But at least to begin with, start that into a training course. And this idea was, I would say, also somewhat well received. They seemed a bit unsure about how to do this, but I'm working on it, right? Australia already has a lot of regional programs actually that works on this. And so they have a women's climate literacy program, which I thought is something this whole certificate course could just sit within. So we don't even need to create a whole new system for it. Australia has already earmarked funds for the next 4 years for this program. And so it just sits within that. I mean, I mentioned already, I think a lot of these opportunities for joint action. And I just want to reiterate, right, that the idea is, and sometimes when you talk to people in the foreign ministry or in a defense ministry, they're like, oh, but that's not our job. But building long-term security for your country, for your region, for your neighborhood, or for the world, if you're so altruistic, then is your job, right? And understanding what non-traditional security looks like in relationship to more traditional security is extremely important. So how do you build climate resilience from a food, health, water, understanding climate perspective, looking at it from a heat, urban development, gender lens to ensure then that your long-term security is actually safeguarded, is where I think then that potential lies. And that's the areas that I've been um, researching. Yeah, I think that's it from me. Yeah, I realize I went through quite a bit over here. So happy to answer questions, take comments, ideas. Se- Seriously, I'm very serious about the ideas because I do have the ability to put them together in briefs and documents and present them to the government. So if there are ideas and you want to tell me later also, that's fine. But I want to just say thank you again to all of you for listening. Thank you to the Institute for having me. And but yeah, I'll stop now.